Thanks for the opportunity to present the research today, and I look forward to hearing your questions and responses. So this is joint work with Timothy Brick, who's, since we started this, actually became the rector of the Kiev School of Economics. So he's quite a busy man now, but we were instrumental in this project, which we started together just around, in fact, in sort of March 2022. So, and also I'd like to thank the LSE who funded the data collection, the project that I'm going to be talking about today. And also to thank the fieldwork organisation Gradus, which undertook the fieldwork for us, the survey of the panel in sometimes what were quite difficult circumstances. In fact, such that it actually determined to some extent the timing of the third wave, because they didn't have the capacity to do it any sooner than they did, but they completed it nevertheless. So very grateful to them. Not the easiest situation to be working in. So I'm going to start by talking about and I hope you can see the slides well enough, because there's a certain amount of text on them, but I'll be speaking to it as well. Talking about what we know about migration and displacement in Ukraine since 24th of February 2022. So from a report in September 2023, it was estimated that 3 million people were internally displaced within Ukraine at that point, with another nearly 5 million having both moved away and then returned home. UNHCR estimates from the similar time give the number of refugees, so those internationally displaced, as around 5.9 million. And of course, as well as those who've moved and displaced, there are many more living in Ukraine who are in need of humanitarian assistance. And the IOM estimated that more than 17 million people were in need of urgent humanitarian assistance inside Ukraine as of last September. And of course, I'm talking about the situation since 24th of February 2022, but this comes on top of ongoing conflict-related displacement since 2014. When there was the fighting in the Donbass region and the annexation of Crimea, which stimulated quite a lot of movement. And so there's this sort of layering of migration, layering of experience of displacement. So but the recent moves, the recent refugee flow has been characterised as the largest and fastest movement of refugees since the end of World War II. So it really was a very dramatic move outside Ukraine, even if there has been a certain amount of return movement since, and a very swift, quite dramatic movement of internally displaced, moving primarily from the eastern areas of Ukraine. But what we also see is that there's substantial overlap in terms of where people move from and where they move to. So at certain points, people were moving away from Kiev when it was seen as under attack, but people were also moving towards Kiev as a place where there were more opportunities for refugees as well. So we see some of this sort of circularity and overlap of kind of sending and receiving regions. So that's going to give you a very sort of brief overview of the context. Some of which you will probably already know, and it gives the context for this study. So we know quite a lot about refugees, particularly refugees in Europe, and much of our understanding of migration in response to conflict comes from studies of those who move across international borders, so international refugees. But it's made clear, and globally, the majority of displacement in response to conflict tends to be internal rather than international. And of course, in most conflict-affected countries, the majority of the population do not move. Exceptionally, more move than don't, but that's very exceptional. So that leads us to think about, in more detail, who actually moves and why, and who moves internally as well as who moves internationally. What facilitates the move of those who migrate in response to conflict, and what drives migration intentions and plans, but also intentions and plans to return. And then the question that we see discussed quite a lot in relation to refugees again, but perhaps less in relation to internally displaced and people who don't move, is how do people adapt over time? How do they adapt in terms of their expectations and their plans? And there are some answers to these questions. Existing research provides some answers to these. For example, that people who move tend to have some resources with which to move in the first place, so they tend to be slightly more resourced than those who don't move. We know that networks facilitate movement, for example. We know that people are more likely, some research suggests that people are more likely to move immediately if they're going to move at all in response to conflict, and then that there is some adaptation. And we also know that return migration plans are often very susceptible to the conditions in the origin country rather than to kind of the push factors from the destination country, but are also affected by the ease of movement, the ease of which they can change their mind, as it were, return migrate, but also still have the option of out-migrating again. So we know something in terms of answers to questions, but not all of it is consistent. It may be also related specifically to the particular context under study. And so there's still much more to be learnt. What we know specifically about Ukrainian displacement since 2022, February 2022, has been particularly focused on refugees in Poland. So there's quite a lot of studies on refugees in Poland because that was the largest recipient country of refugees, but there are also studies of refugees in other European countries as well. This research has been both qualitative, for example, around refugees' resilience and their trajectories, their migration trajectories, and about the role of civil society in facilitating integration and movement. But also quantitative, using register data and large-scale surveys and trying to quantify the scale of migration, but also its consequences. What we've seen very markedly in the Ukrainian context is the dominance of refugee flows by women rather than men, and this makes it quite distinct from other refugee flows to Europe that have been studied in the past. And often women with children. And so the research base has tended to be much more focused, therefore, on thinking about issues around schooling and child welfare than perhaps the earlier standard refugee literature on refugees in Europe. And there's also work which suggests that this children's education has been a driver of quite a lot of the return migration that we've seen. And of course, unlike other refugee flows to Europe, though like most refugee flows worldwide, the country affected borders European countries. So as in the Western world, most refugees tend to move to neighbouring countries, and of course with the example of Ukraine, those neighbouring countries are in Europe. So that's highlighted features that are probably common to refugee flows in other parts of the world but haven't been studied so much in Europe, like the fluidity of cross-border movement. It becomes much more visible. And the network nature of migration. So a lot of the studies of refugees in Poland have shown how people had earlier connections with Poland. Some had been travelling to and from Poland already, and then when the war broke out, that was a natural place to go because of those networks. It also, very strikingly in Poland, in the Polish literature, we've seen the massive cross-border movement. An estimated 8 million people moved across the border, but that there must be lots and lots of either onward movement or primarily return, because 1 million of those were present a year on. So this huge level of fluidity that we perhaps don't often think of so much in relation to migration flows into Europe. But despite the fact that Ukraine is more closely connected with the countries where people have moved to, there's also a highlighting of the fact that economic and social integration does still remain a challenge for these Ukrainian refugees. And going back to the internally displaced who haven't crossed international borders, we see that the internally displaced in Ukraine are facing kind of a very severe economic situation. So that's to give you a brief sort of overview of maybe what the main things we know so far from the research literature, and then I want to say what this research adds. So what we were trying to capture was to get information from very early on moves and on motivations and on people's networks, so how they were moving and who with and where to. So we started early, and then we linked observations across 3 periods, which allowed us to chart the development of people's moves, but also of their orientations and attitudes and their circumstances. And kind of necessity, because of the way we designed it, and because, as I've said, the majority of people don't move and don't leave Ukraine, our main focus has been on the experience of those within Ukraine. And comparing those who move with those who don't move. So to give you just a little bit more detail on the data in the sample, which I think is sort of a sort of fairly unique study in the context of all the other research and literature on Ukraine. We undertook a survey, a national representative survey of 1,000 respondents from an existing panel. So this was an existing survey panel that had been set up to be nationally representative, and then a sample of 1,000 was taken from that. And then these same people were contacted for interview in August 2022 and January 2023. Timothy always points out that this is not kind of totally nationally representative, as the existing sample is largely based on large conurbations. So it doesn't capture the most rural areas, but otherwise it is expected to be largely representative of the population. And because it's a long-standing panel, it has weights, so we can weight to be nationally representative of that population with those caveats. And it covers the whole of the country, so those with very different experiences of the conflict. So we timed it so to capture early experiences and early moves, and then these phased follow-ups. As I say, we tried to recontact the same people each time, but we also had refreshment, so that we managed to recontact around 70% of people wave on wave, but each time the sample was 1,000 people, so we could still look sort of cross-sectionally at a decent sample size. And of those initial 1,000, we contacted 432, gave us responses at all 3 waves. We designed a short questionnaire, around 30 to 40 questions. We tested it early in April 2022 and then put it into the field. So it was implemented via Gradis's mobile phone app. And we made minor modifications at the subsequent waves. And we had prior information, because it was an existing panel, on age, sex, the oblast where the sample had originally come from or been prior to February 2022, and their financial situation. Again, before February 2022. So this just shows you a very little bit about the sample, and it shows the weights which adjust it to be more representative. So as with any survey, women are more likely to respond, and so they need to be sort of down-weighted to give a more representative sample. Okay, so I'll move straight on to the findings. I've got 4 sets of findings, so it's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind tour through them. But I hope we'll give reveal some of the kind of the richness of the findings and the light we can shed on this conflict. So first of all, just simply the patterns of staying and moving. As you can see here, sort of of those people who responded at all 3 waves, around 60% of them didn't move at all. Another 10% had moved by the time we first surveyed them, and moved, as it were, stayed not in their original home, and another roughly 10% had moved early by April 2022, but subsequently returned. And then there was every sort of other combination possible among those. So you can see the dominance of those who actually stay compared to those who move. Then for looking at these early moves, so those who had moved by April 2022, we looked at what predicted such a move. So it's just focused on the wave 1 sample. And as expected, women were more likely to move. Those who came from came from eastern and northern parts of oblasts in Ukraine were more likely to have moved. But we didn't find that those with more resources were more likely to move. So it's not a particularly good measure of resources, but it's the one we have in terms of financial security, and it didn't suggest, so sort of counter to the expectation in the literature that those with more resources were more likely to move. Just to describe, among those who moved, only 13% had moved on their own. So in these 300 people, and others had moved with various combinations of spouse, children, parents, pets. Timothy tells me that pets are very important to Ukrainians, so he's very keen to get questions on that in there. But some, 18% had left a spouse or a partner behind, 32% had left parents, and 17% had still nevertheless left pets. About 40%, about 2/5 of them had left nobody behind. So they'd either had nobody to leave or had taken everybody with them. And in terms of moves, the strongest feature of why they moved where they had was that they knew people there. So emphasising the network nature of this migration. And it was the proximity, it being the nearest possible place, was only secondary to them knowing people there. So moving on to looking at how movers and stayers were similar or different. This shows some of the measures I chose to compare here, and where the test figure is in red, that's where it's statistically significant. So movers and stayers were different. So this shows us, perhaps unsurprisingly, that people who stayed were more likely to be in work than people who'd moved. Again, they're just at this very early stage, and those who'd moved were less likely to say they definitely had enough to live on, so more financially constrained. And those who moved seemed to be a little less positive in terms, or optimistic about the future of Ukraine. We had a range of questions about optimism. So that was looking at the comparison of movers and stayers just at that first wave, and then we were interested in this question of adaptation. So we looked at how things changed over the panel, and I don't know how well you can see this, but I've got split over the three waves. We've got in blue male stayers, in red male movers, in green female stayers, and in yellow female movers. And so that shows that for all of them, chances of being paid work improved, but particularly for male movers, so they got into work. And while female stayers and movers converged with each other, but had low employment rates. In terms of financial constraints, these did seem to decline a little bit over time by the second wave, but it increased again for movers by the third wave, by January 2023, in particular, while not for those who stayed so much. Hopefulness about the future certainly seemed to show a decline and then some stabilisation. So this is about their own future, while expectations about children's future just showed a steady decline across all groups. Though again, with the stayers being a bit more positive than the movers. For the last two is the expectations about the future. So there were people who asked about the expectations about their own future. And again, you can see that there's a decline in positivity about their own future for both movers and stayers. I haven't separated by sex here because there was really no difference between the men and the women. And then about the future of Ukraine, you can see here again that there was those who moved, there was a strongly declining optimism. So that optimism effect that seemed very present in February, March, April of 2022, clearly declining, and particularly for those who moved away, while there's some recovery, some increased hope for the future of Ukraine for those who stayed put. So there's some sort of divergence there of their positions. that's the findings we've got so far, and so these are just the very brief conclusions from this. So what we've done is captured the immediate aftermath of the war in Ukraine, and how people situated less than 2 months after the invasion, and how that changes over time, what emerges over time in terms of their transitions, experiences and attitudes. The main driver of moves is the original location, as we might expect, but we're also seeing these moves to and from places, some people moving into Kiev and some people moving out, for example. Noted that the choice of location where people move to seems to be driven primarily by networks, which is consistent with the literature, but financial resources don't seem to matter for the act of moving itself, which is not consistent with the literature. And those who moved faced increased chances of being financially insecure, which might be something we would expect. Both movers and stayers seem to face rather low levels of employment, and they also seem to face quite severe levels of economic constraints. Though there was some improvement over time, conversely, optimism started rather high, but seemed to decline over time, and this seemed to be particularly the case among those who'd moved. So that's all I've got to say, but as mentioned, I've been working with colleagues on a podcast, so if you're interested in more on this, there's a series here called Migration, Conflict and Crisis, a quite short podcast series, but it's got some very interesting findings, including about Ukraine. So an interview with Timothy himself about the situation in Ukraine, the features of the conflict, drawing a range of research, and also with Carolina Cheska-Shaw and Luke Cooper, who is here at LSE and LSE Ideas, about the experience of refugees Ukrainian refugees in Poland particularly, but also touching on other parts of the world. So Perry Demarche from IOM was talking about this very severe situation in Sudan, and this sort of massive displacement of people there. And shortly I'll be talking to Maeve Patterson from UNHCR about policy responses. So do look it up. There's a link there, and I can provide you with a link if you're interested. So that's it. Thank you very much.